Civilizations can vanish in the space of a single lifetime. Around the year 1177 BC, the grand and interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age came to a sudden, shattering end. Palaces burned, trade routes fell silent, and entire languages were forgotten. This was not a slow fade, but a rapid unraveling that rewrote human history. By the end of this journey, you will understand how this ancient collapse forged the world that came after, from the rise of iron to the birth of new nations. We will investigate whether the cause was mysterious sea raiders, a changing climate, or a flaw in the system itself. What does it feel like to watch your entire world disappear? For a moment, think of the Late Bronze Age not as ancient history, but as a thriving international marketplace. Imagine a world where a merchant from Greece could sail to Egypt with a cargo of olive oil, trade for gold and papyrus, and hear news from the court of the Hittite king, all within a single season. This was a reality. From roughly the 16th to the 12th century BC, the civilizations ringing the Mediterranean and the Near East were bound together in a complex web of commerce and diplomacy, a system more interconnected than anyone would have believed possible for its time. The lifeblood of this age was bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. But here is the catch: the copper might come from mines on the island of Cyprus, while the tin, a rarer metal, traveled thousands of miles from sources as far away as modern Afghanistan. This necessity created a network. Ships carried these raw materials alongside finished goods, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, and exquisite pottery from Greece, linking palaces and ports across vast distances. The major powers of the day formed what scholars now call the Club of the Great Powers. In the south stood the Egyptian New Kingdom, a land of immense wealth and military might, its pharaohs like Ramesses III building monuments to proclaim their eternal strength. To the north, in what is now Turkey, the Hittite Empire held sway, a formidable kingdom of charioteers and shrewd diplomats. Across the Aegean Sea, the Mycenaean Greeks ruled from fortified palace complexes like Mycenae and Pylos, their walls so massive later generations would think giants built them. And along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, the prosperous city-states of Canaan acted as vital trading hubs and cultural crossroads. These kingdoms did not exist in isolation. They were in constant contact. The best evidence for this comes from a remarkable archaeological find, the Amarna letters. Discovered in Egypt, this archive of clay tablets contains diplomatic correspondence written in a shared diplomatic language, Akkadian. In these letters, kings address each other as brothers. They negotiate treaties, arrange royal marriages, and exchange lavish gifts: gold, silver, chariots, and even physicians. One king complains that the gold sent to him was not as pure as last time. Another requests a statue be made in his likeness. It reads like the boardroom politics of a global corporation, but it is 3,200 years old. This system created incredible prosperity and stability, but it also created a profound vulnerability. Every palace, every city, was dependent on goods and information flowing smoothly along those trade routes. The entire edifice was built on an assumption of continuity. If one link in that chain were to break, if the tin shipment stopped, or if the diplomatic messengers failed to arrive, the whole delicate structure could begin to tremble. The prosperity of the age had, without anyone realizing it, woven a web that was both a lifeline and a potential snare. Then the first cracks began to appear in this glittering world. Trade goods became scarcer, diplomatic letters grew more desperate, and a palpable tension began to ripple through the network. And from this growing instability, from the fog of history, emerged the most iconic agents of the collapse, a force so shadowy we know them only by the name given by their victims, the Sea Peoples. The most vivid window into their terrifying arrival is carved in stone on the walls of Pharaoh Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu in Egypt. The reliefs show a scene of utter chaos, a pitched naval battle where Egyptian forces clash with an array of invaders. Their ships are unlike the Egyptian vessels, their warriors wear distinctive feathered headdresses, and the scene is one of violent turmoil. In accompanying inscriptions, Ramesses boasts a great victory, claiming that no land could stand before the arms of these confederated tribes. He lists their exotic, unfamiliar names: the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyon, the Tjeka. These names are our primary clues, but they are clues without a clear answer. Who were these people? For over a century, this has been one of history's most compelling detective stories. The traditional, dramatic narrative casts them as a mysterious horde from the sea, barbarian destroyers who swept in from nowhere to topple empires. But modern scholarship paints a more nuanced and perhaps more frightening picture. It is unlikely they emerged from a vacuum. A leading theory suggests they were not a single ethnic group, but a coalition of displaced populations, refugees and warriors set adrift by the initial tremors of the wider collapse. Some groups, like the Peliset, are widely believed to be the Philistines who later settled on the coast of Canaan. Their material culture shows strong connections to the Aegean world, the very world of the collapsing Mycenaean palaces. Others may have come from Anatolia, Sardinia, or Sicily. They were likely a mix of displaced farmers, skilled sailors, and desperate soldiers, their homelands perhaps ravaged by drought or internal strife. They moved not as a unified army with a grand plan, but as a migratory wave, part of a vast human domino effect. They were both a cause and a consequence. Think of them not as the match that lit the fire, but as the wind that turned a smoldering ember into a wildfire. The great kingdoms were already straining under internal pressures, their complex economies fragile. The arrival of these armed, mobile groups seeking land and resources was a shock the system could not absorb. They attacked vulnerable coastal cities, disrupted the crucial sea lanes that were the arteries of Bronze Age commerce, and sacked already weakened administrative centers. They were the perfect storm, exploiting every weakness. So while the reliefs at Medinet Habu show a climactic battle, the truth is that the Sea Peoples were less an invading army that conquered a healthy world, and more a symptom of a world already in critical condition. They were the violent, visible wave that finally crashed over civilizations whose foundations had been silently eroding for years. This brings us to a deeper, more unsettling question. If these raiders were a symptom, what was the underlying illness? What invisible force could have weakened these mighty kingdoms from within, making them vulnerable to such a wave? While the Sea Peoples represent a human wave of disruption, another suspect leaves no monuments and writes no letters. It is a force that operates on a scale beyond kingdoms and armies, the very climate of the planet itself. To understand this theory, we must look not to crumbling walls, but to silent, frozen archives buried deep within glaciers and at the bottom of ancient lakes. Scientists drill into ice cores in Greenland and analyze sediment layers from the bed of the Sea of Galilee, reading them like chapters in the Earth's own diary. What these natural records reveal is a profound and prolonged climatic shift beginning around 1200 BC, a period researchers call the 3.2 kilo-year event. The Eastern Mediterranean, the fertile cradle of these civilizations, entered a centuries-long phase of colder, drier weather. The impact of this shift cannot be overstated. Think of the great Bronze Age empires as intricate machines powered by grain. The pharaoh's Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world, its wealth built on the predictable flood of the Nile. The Hittite kingdom in Anatolia relied on steady rains to water its plains. When those rains failed year after year, and when temperatures dropped even a few degrees, the entire agricultural foundation began to crumble. Crop yields plummeted. What was once a surplus stored in palace granaries to feed armies, artisans, and bureaucrats dwindled into shortage. Famine ceased to be a local hardship and became a regional epidemic. Paleoclimatologists can trace this drought signal across the entire region, a synchronized environmental stressor that left no kingdom untouched. This transforms the narrative from a simple story of invasion into a far more tragic and complex struggle. A king's legitimacy in the Bronze Age was not just about military might, it was fundamentally a contract. The palace collected grain as taxes, stored it, and redistributed it to the people, especially in lean times. It was the ultimate source of economic and political stability. But what happens when the granaries stay empty? No matter how much the king demands, the contract breaks. The central authority loses its reason for being. Farmers facing starvation would abandon their fields. Skilled craftsmen could no longer be fed or paid. Soldiers might desert or turn to mercenary work for anyone who could offer a meal. The societal glue that held these complex palatial economies together dissolved under the relentless pressure of hunger. This climate catastrophe did not necessarily cause the collapse on its own, but it created the perfect, desperate conditions for it. It turned stable populations into refugees, searching for food and safety, groups that might later be recorded as those mysterious sea peoples. It strained the diplomatic ties between kingdoms as each hoarded its dwindling resources. It made societies brittle so that when the next shock came, whether from a migrating group or an internal revolt, they shattered rather than bent. The earth itself turned against the world it had helped create. This leads us to a haunting realization. Perhaps the collapse was not triggered by a single enemy, but by a cascade of failures. If the climate weakened the body and invaders attacked the wounds, could there have been a third, even more insidious sickness already at work within the heart of the system itself? The grand palaces were not just centers of power, they were immense economic engines. Inside their walls, armies of scribes meticulously tracked every transaction, every jar of olive oil, every measure of grain paid as tax. This was a world of stunning organization, but also one of rigid control. The wealth flowed upward, concentrating in the hands of a small elite of kings, priests, and military commanders. For the farmers, the artisans, and the sailors whose labor truly powered this system, life was a delicate balance. They worked lands they did not own, paid a significant portion of their harvest to the palace, and were often drafted for state projects, building roads, fortifications, and temples. This was the social contract of the Bronze Age, stability in exchange for obedience and tribute. But what happens when that contract is broken by the very powers that enforce it? When the rains failed and famine spread, the palace's demand for grain did not cease. If anything, the pressure would have intensified as the rulers sought to fill their own emptying storehouses. Imagine you are a farmer. Your fields have withered under a relentless sun for 2 years. Your family is hungry, and yet the king's tax collector still arrives, demanding the same share of a harvest that does not exist. The resentment would have simmered, then boiled over. This theory suggests the final blow to many Bronze Age centers was not a foreign invasion, but a domestic uprising. The people upon whom the entire structure depended may have finally turned against it. Archaeology offers haunting clues that support this idea. At the Mycenaean palace of Pylos in Greece, the end came with fire. But it is the specific nature of the destruction that gives scholars pause. In the archive room, where clay tablets recorded the palace's wealth and administration, the fire was particularly intense. The tablets, hardened by the flames, survived to tell a final story. Some researchers argue that such targeted burning could indicate a deliberate act by a revolting populace. It was not just about destroying a building, it was about obliterating the very records of debt, obligation, and control. It was an attack on the system itself. Similar patterns appear elsewhere, from the ruins of Knossos on Crete to sites across Anatolia. The palaces did not just fall, they were often thoroughly sacked and burned from the inside out. This perspective transforms the collapse from a mysterious external event into a profound human drama. It asks us to consider the immense weight borne by the common people. The sailors who kept the trade routes open, the farmers who fed the cities, the laborers who built the walls, they were the true foundation. When that foundation, stressed by climate disaster and exploited by a top-heavy system, finally gave way, the entire civilization came crashing down. The elite, who had believed their power was divinely ordained and unshakable, discovered a harsh truth: no kingdom can stand when its people have nothing left to lose. So we are left with a convergence of catastrophes. A changing climate strained the environment. Migrating groups of displaced people applied external pressure. And from within, social fractures widened into revolts. It was a perfect storm where every weakness was exploited. But in the ashes of this shattered world, something new had to emerge. What could possibly rise from such total ruin? Perhaps the greatest vulnerability was not an external enemy, but the very architecture of their success. The late Bronze Age world had achieved something remarkable, a level of interconnection that would not be seen again for over 1,000 years. Yet this deep interdependence created a hidden trap, a fragility that modern historians call a systems collapse. In a tightly linked network, a shock in one area does not stay contained. It travels along the lines of trade and communication, amplifying as it goes, until a local crisis becomes a global catastrophe. The entire system was only as strong as its weakest link. Consider the lifeblood of the age, bronze. To make this essential alloy, you needed two metals, copper and tin. Copper was relatively plentiful, mined in places like Cyprus, but tin was exceedingly rare. The primary sources for the great kingdoms were thousands of miles away, in regions like modern Afghanistan. This meant a single, fragile supply chain stretched across continents, through mountains and deserts, reliant on the stability of every territory it passed through. Now imagine a disruption. Perhaps migrating groups in Anatolia made overland routes unsafe. Maybe a local conflict near the tin mines halted production. Suddenly, the shipments stop. Without tin, the bronze workshops from Greece to Mesopotamia fall silent. No new weapons can be forged for the king's army. No new tools can be made for farmers or shipwrights. The entire economic and military engine begins to seize up. This is not just ancient history, it is a pattern. Think of a modern global supply chain shock. When a single port faces a major delay or a key factory shuts down, the effects ripple outward. Car manufacturers cannot finish vehicles, store shelves run low, and prices spike worldwide. The late Bronze Age experienced a version of this on a civilizational scale, but with no alternative suppliers, no digital logistics to reroute shipments, and no reserve systems. A failure in one node caused cascading failures everywhere. This is why scholars like historian Eric H. Klein describe the collapse not as a single event, but as a perfect storm. The drought placed immense environmental stress on every kingdom. Internal social unrest from overtaxed farmers and hungry citizens made societies brittle. The movement of displaced populations, the Sea Peoples, applied a devastating external shock, but it was the deep interconnectedness of it all that turned these individual problems into an unsolvable crisis. A kingdom weakened by famine could not call on its allies for grain because its allies were also starving. A city whose bronze supplies were cut could not rebuild its army to defend against raiders. The very networks that had brought them wealth and stability became channels of contagion, spreading collapse instead of commerce. There is a profound lesson here about the nature of complex systems. Interdependence creates efficiency and prosperity, but it also creates shared risk. The stronger the connections, the more vulnerable the entire web becomes to a synchronized failure. The late Bronze Age world learned this the hardest way possible. Their glittering globalized age did not end with a bang or a single mysterious invader, but with a whisper, the silence of empty trade routes and abandoned ports. Yet from that silence, something entirely new was about to be born. What emerges when a complex, centralized world dissolves? The silence that followed the collapse was not empty. It was a forge. From the ashes of the centralized, bronze-dependent world, new forms of society began to emerge, ones that were smaller, more flexible, and built around a different metal entirely. But to understand this rebirth, we must first witness a death so complete it seemed to erase a superpower from the earth itself. This is the story of the Hittites. In the high, windswept plains of central Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, stood Hattusa. For over 400 years, it was the nerve center of an empire that rivaled Egypt. Its fortifications were legendary, walls of cyclopean stone that seemed to grow from the bedrock, guarded by a majestic lion gate. Inside, a vast archive of clay tablets recorded every detail of statecraft, diplomacy, and law in the distinctive wedge-shaped script of cuneiform. The Hittite king was not just a ruler, he was a military innovator whose chariots were the terror of the battlefield, and a diplomat who negotiated as an equal with the pharaoh. Then, around the year 1180 BC, everything stopped. The end at Hattusa is written in layers of ash and scorched stone. The city did not slowly decline. It was consumed by a great fire so intense it baked and preserved the very clay tablets that tell its story. After the flames died, no one came back to rebuild the palace or reoccupy the temples. The capital of a mighty empire was simply walked away from, left to the wind and weeds for 3,000 years. Royal correspondence ceases. The names of kings vanish from the record. It is as if a vibrant, complex conversation was suddenly cut off mid-sentence. So what could have shattered such a powerful state? Archaeologists see not one cause, but a fatal convergence. The Hittite heartland on the Anatolian plateau was always a land of marginal agriculture. Its prosperity depended on supplemental grain shipped from its fertile provinces to the south, in Syria and the Levant. This was the empire's lifeline, but as the Sea Peoples and other migrant groups disrupted the coasts, and as drought gripped the entire region, that lifeline was severed. The grain ships stopped coming. At the same time, the climatic droughts we discussed earlier hit the high plateau with brutal force. Hittite prayers to the storm god for rain, preserved on their tablets, grew increasingly desperate. A kingdom built on grain distribution cannot function when the granaries are empty. Social order begins to fray. There is also evidence of internal political instability, perhaps dynastic conflicts over a shrinking throne. A kingdom under such immense stress from famine and external pressure becomes brittle. The result was not a conquest by a named enemy, but a catastrophic failure. The central authority dissolved, the population, facing starvation, likely dispersed into smaller, mobile groups. The great capital, its symbolic power broken, was put to the torch, possibly in an act of final defiance or simply as chaos took hold. The totality of the Hittite vanishing is what is most haunting. Their language, once the tongue of treaties and decrees, fell silent. Their unique form of cuneiform was forgotten. For millennia, the Bible and a few Egyptian inscriptions were the only faint echoes of their existence. They became a ghost empire, a rumor in the historical record. It was only in the early 20th century, when archaeologists deciphered the clay tablets from the ruins of Hattusa, that this lost superpower stepped back into the light. Their rediscovery is a powerful reminder of how fragile even the mightiest civilizations can be, and how entire chapters of the human story can lie buried, waiting to be read again. But if one empire could vanish so utterly, what about the others? What fate awaited the legendary citadels of the Mycenaean Greeks, The same silence that swallowed Hattusa also fell upon the sun-baked citadels of Greece. This was the world Homer would later sing of, a landscape of warrior kings and labyrinthine palaces like Mycenaean, crowned by its famous Lion Gate. Yet the archaeology reveals a final chapter not of epic glory but of smoke and collapse. Around the year 1200 BC, a wave of fire swept through the major centers. At Pylos, Turin, and Mycenae itself, archaeologists uncover what they call destruction layers, thick strata of ash, charcoal, and shattered masonry that speak of a violent and sudden end. The great halls where wanaks, or kings, once presided over complex administrations were reduced to scorched rubble. Who held the torch for generations? The answer seemed to come from later Greek historians themselves, who spoke of an invasion by a new wave of Greek-speaking people, the Dorians, descending from the north. This neat narrative of one group replacing another is compelling, but the archaeological evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. There is no clear, sudden arrival of a new culture in the pottery or artifacts left in the ashes. This ambiguity has led to another, more intimate and troubling theory. Perhaps the fires were lit from within. The Mycenaean world was not a unified nation, but a collection of rival kingdoms, each based in its own fortified palace. Inscriptions in Linear B, their written script, hint at a society intensely focused on military preparedness, stockpiling weapons and chariots. It is possible that as the wider system of trade disintegrated and resources grew scarce, these rivalries erupted into a final, catastrophic war. King may have turned against king, burning each other's strongholds in a struggle over a shrinking world. The aftermath was a profound unraveling. The art of writing vanished entirely. Linear B, used solely for palace accounting, died with the palaces that needed it. The knowledge of monumental stone construction, of building those colossal walls and beehive tombs, was lost for centuries. The population plummeted, with estimates suggesting a decline of up to 90% in some areas. Survivors retreated from the coasts to easily defensible hilltops, or simply abandoned the region altogether. The intricate network of specialized artisans, scribes, and soldiers dissolved. What remained was a world reduced to its simplest elements. This period, stretching for nearly 400 years, is what scholars call the Greek Dark Age. The term does not imply a lack of humanity, but a dramatic simplification. Gone were the grand palaces and their bureaucracies. In their place stood small, scattered villages of farmers and herders living in modest huts. The vibrant trade in luxury goods ceased, replaced by local self-sufficiency. The glorious artwork of the Mycenaeans gave way to pottery decorated with simple, geometric patterns. It was a hard reset, a return to a more basic way of life after the complex system that supported high culture had imploded. Yet within this stark simplicity lay a crucial seed. The collapse of the top-heavy palatial system dismantled the old, rigid hierarchies. From this fragmented, egalitarian landscape of small communities, a new form of social organization would slowly, centuries later, begin to coalesce, the independent polis or city-state. The world of Achilles had to end for the world of Athens and Sparta to eventually be born. But one great civilization seemed to defy this pattern of total ruin, holding on while others fell. How did the ancient land of the pharaohs manage to survive the storm when so many others were swept away? The final plea of a dying city was etched onto a clay tablet and left unsent. In the ruins of Ugarit, a once thriving port on the coast of modern-day Syria, archaeologists found this last, desperate message. It was addressed to the king of Elachia, the island of Cyprus, Ugarit's ally and trading partner. The letter reads, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." The scribe never finished the line, leaving the final word incomplete, as if the writer was interrupted by the very destruction he described. This single artifact, more than any other, captures the sudden, paralyzing terror of those final days. Ugarit was the epitome of late Bronze Age cosmopolitan success. Its libraries held texts in a dozen languages, its merchants traded from Egypt to Anatolia, and its scribes had even developed a revolutionary new alphabet, one of the first, designed for simplicity. It was a hub of ideas and wealth, and then it was simply gone. The archaeological record confirms the letter's horror. The city shows clear signs of a violent, thorough sacking followed by an intense fire. After that fire cooled, no one returned to rebuild the palace or restart the schools. The port fell silent, its alphabet nearly forgotten, buried under the dust for centuries. Ugarit's fate was shared by other mighty city-states inland. The great Canaanite centers of Hazor and Megiddo, cities of legend that guarded vital trade routes, also met their end in layers of ash and destruction. The entire Levant, that fertile corridor of commerce, became a landscape of fire. Yet, if we look closer at this scorched earth, we see a crucial nuance in the story of collapse. It was not a uniform extinction. Along the coast to the north, a different pattern emerged. In cities like Tyre and Sidon, the destruction was severe, but it was not total. Elements of the older Canaanite culture, the shipbuilding skills, the mercantile knowledge, the alphabetic writing, managed to survive the inferno. The people there adapted. They pulled back, consolidated, and slowly began to rebuild their lives around what they could salvage, which was primarily their connection to the sea. From this painful transformation, a new kind of power was born. These survivors would become the Phoenicians. In the centuries following the collapse, with the great empires of the interior gone or weakened, these coastal cities flourished anew. They became the new masters of Mediterranean trade, not as part of a palace-controlled system, but as independent, agile merchant republics. They perfected the alphabet Ugarit had invented, spreading it across the ancient world, a gift of literacy rising from the ashes. The Levant, therefore, shows us the two faces of the Bronze Age collapse. For some, like Ugarit, it was an absolute, devastating end. For others, it was a brutal pruning, a forced evolution that stripped away the old political structures but allowed core skills and knowledge to persist and eventually blossom into something entirely new. This raises a profound question about the nature of historical change. Can a civilization truly die, or does it merely transform under unbearable pressure? And if survival is possible, what does it take? One kingdom, more than any other, claimed to have found the answer, boasting of a great victory that saved its very soul. How did ancient Egypt, the greatest power of the age, confront the storm, and what price did it pay for survival? The pharaoh's victory was carved in stone for eternity, but it was a story told by the survivor. While the Hittite Empire vanished and Mycenaean palaces turned to ash, Egypt did not fall. It endured, but its survival came at a price so steep it would redefine the kingdom for centuries. The reign of Ramesses III marks the last great gasp of the Egyptian New Kingdom. The reliefs at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu are a masterpiece of propaganda, showing the pharaoh standing triumphant on his chariot, his archers raining arrows upon a chaotic mass of sea peoples in a great land battle. Another scene depicts a naval engagement, with Egyptian vessels grappling with the invaders' distinctive ships, enemy bodies tumbling into the Nile. The inscriptions declare a decisive victory, a salvation of the civilized world. And in a narrow military sense, it was true. Egypt repelled the direct assault, but to view this as a simple triumph is to miss the deeper, more troubling reality. Egypt won the battle, but it was a fortress under siege, and the siege changed everything. What allowed Egypt to hold the line when others could not? Two immense geographical gifts provided a crucial buffer. First, the Nile. While the kingdoms of Anatolia and the Levant withered under prolonged drought, Egypt's agriculture was not dependent on unpredictable rains. It relied on the annual inundation, the Nile flood. even if regional climate patterns shifted, the river's water, fed by distant monsoon rains in Ethiopia, continued to flow. The fields of the Nile Valley could still produce grain when the rest of the region was starving. This was an economic and social lifeline no other major power possessed. Second, Egypt was protected by vast, empty deserts to the east and west. These natural barriers funneled invaders toward predictable coastal or delta routes, which could be fortified and defended. The sea peoples could not simply walk into the Egyptian heartland. They had to come by sea or along a narrow strip of land where they met a prepared, concentrated army. Yet the cost of this defense bled the kingdom dry. Fighting a series of major campaigns against a determined foe exhausted the royal treasury. The gold and wealth accumulated over centuries of empire were spent on war. To pay for it all, the state likely increased taxes on its own people and funneled resources away from other vital functions. The central authority of the pharaoh, once considered a living god, began to weaken under this strain. And there was another, more profound loss. To secure its core, Egypt effectively abandoned its empire. Its control over the wealthy cities of Canaan, the source of tribute and a strategic buffer zone, collapsed. The world beyond the Sinai was no longer an Egyptian sphere of influence, but a fractured, unknown landscape. The victory at Medinet Habu was not a prelude to renewed expansion, but a desperate, successful act of contraction. The aftermath within Egypt reveals the true nature of this Pyrrhic survival. The following decades saw a steep decline. The economy stagnated under the weight of debt and depleted resources. Political fragmentation set in as central control loosened, with local governors gaining more power. Perhaps most tellingly, the balance of power shifted dramatically toward the temples. The priestly class, already wealthy, grew immensely powerful as a nervous monarchy granted them more land and privileges to secure divine favor in turbulent times. The state that emerged from the crisis was a shadow of its former self, turned inward and defensive. Egypt did not disappear, but it entered a long period of stagnation, often called the Third Intermediate Period. It never regained the imperial reach, the confident foreign engagement, or the sheer monumental ambition of its Bronze Age peak. This Egyptian case delivers a sobering lesson about systemic collapse. Even the apparent winner can be profoundly diminished. Survival does not mean emerging unscathed. It often means retreating into a smaller, harder shell. Egypt traded its expansive, outward-looking empire for a fortified, inward-focused nation. It saved its civilization, but in doing so, it had to let go of the very things that had made it a great power. The world was now irrevocably smaller and more dangerous, and as the dust settled across the Mediterranean, a profound question hung in the air: what fills the void when empires recede? In the silence left by the collapse, amid the scattered villages and abandoned trade routes, the seeds of a completely new age were quietly taking root. Far to the east, beyond the shattered coasts of the Mediterranean, the tremors of collapse arrived as a distant, though still powerful, shockwave. The great river civilizations of Mesopotamia, ancient Babylon, and the rising power of Assyria felt the world unraveling, but they did not break. Their experience offers a vital clue, revealing that the end of the Bronze Age was not a universal apocalypse, but a disaster with a very specific geography. While the palace economies of the West burned, the East endured. Why was their fate so different? The answer lies in the very networks that had once enriched them. Mesopotamia was deeply connected to the international system, but its heartland was anchored far from the epicenter of the storm. The primary theater of destruction was the Mediterranean coastline, the highway for the sea peoples and the crucial maritime trade that fed the Western palaces. Mesopotamia's connections ran overland through Syria and Anatolia, or down the Persian Gulf. When the ports of the Levant went silent, it was a severe economic blow, but not an immediate existential threat. Their agricultural base, fed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, remained intact. They were insulated by sheer distance from the most violent waves of disruption. This does not mean they escaped unscathed. The weakening of the great Western powers and the disruption of overland routes created a power vacuum on their frontiers. New groups, particularly tribal confederations known as the Arameans, began to move into the Syrian steppe and press against Mesopotamian cities. These were not a unified naval force like the Sea Peoples, but mobile pastoralists taking advantage of receding imperial control. For a time, both Assyria and Babylon entered a period of diminished power, often called a Dark Age in their own records, where royal inscriptions become scarce and central authority wanes. Yet critically, the thread of their civilization was never cut. In Babylon, the scholarly flame never went out. The great temple libraries and schools of scribes, the very institutions that preserved knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and literature, continued their work. The cultural and religious identity of the city, with its patron god Marduk and its epic traditions like the Enuma Elish, persisted through the political turbulence. This continuity of knowledge and identity provided a stable core from which to eventually rebuild. Assyria's story is even more telling of this resilience. The Assyrian state contracted, pulling back from its wider holdings, but it held onto its heartland around the cities of Ashur and Nineveh. The Assyrian king remained, the bureaucracy adapted, and the military tradition, though tested, was not forgotten. They were pressured but not obliterated. This period of contraction was not an ending, but a strategic retreat. After weathering the worst of the crisis, Assyria would gather its strength in the coming centuries and explode back onto the world stage with terrifying force as the Neo-Assyrian Empire, an imperial machine more centralized and aggressive than anything the Bronze Age had seen. The Mesopotamian experience forces us to redraw the map of the collapse. It was not a blanket of darkness falling equally everywhere. It was a crisis that radiated outward from its nexus in the interconnected Eastern Mediterranean. The severity of the impact was directly proportional to a civilization's depth of entanglement in that specific web of maritime trade and its proximity to the migrating pressures. The core of the system suffered a fatal seizure, while the peripheries, though shaken, managed to stabilize. This comparative view reveals a profound truth about historical change. Civilizations are not isolated entities, they exist within ecosystems of exchange. When that ecosystem suffers a catastrophic failure, the most specialized and dependent members are the first to perish. Those with more diverse connections, or those fortunate enough to be on the edges, have a buffer, a chance to adapt and endure. The legacy of Mesopotamia's survival would shape the next age, but in the West, where the old world had truly vanished, a different and more fundamental transformation was already underway. What emerges from the ashes when all the old certainties are gone? The silence that fell was not just one of empty cities, but of forgotten words. Across the regions hardest hit by the collapse, one of the most chilling losses was the sudden disappearance of writing itself. In the Mycenaean world, the complex script known as Linear B, used by palace scribes to track everything from chariot wheels to offerings to the gods, was never written again. On Cyprus, the enigmatic Cypro-Minoan script vanished. In Anatolia, the intricate Luwian hieroglyphs that once adorned monuments and seals fell silent. It was as if a circuit breaker had been thrown, plunging entire cultures into a profound informational darkness. This was more than just a change in fashion. The loss of these scripts meant the abrupt end of bureaucratic memory. Think of a modern society suddenly losing all its written contracts, its tax records, its inventory lists, and its technical manuals. The intricate palace economies we discussed earlier were utterly dependent on this written record keeping. Without scribes to tally incoming grain, allocate bronze to smiths, or record distributions of wool, the entire administrative machine ground to a halt and could not be restarted. The knowledge of how to manage a complex state was not just neglected, it was erased from living memory. The consequence was a rupture in history itself. For the Greeks who emerged centuries later, the massive stone walls of Mycenae and Tiryns were the work of a mythical race of giants, the Cyclopes. The heroic tales of the Trojan War were preserved only as oral poetry, evolving through generations of storytellers before Homer finally wrote them down. The actual, day-to-day history of those Bronze Age kingdoms, their kings, their treaties, their economic concerns, was completely lost. This created a true dark age in the historical sense, a gap in the record where we must rely on archaeology to whisper what writing once shouted. Yet this blackout was not total. Its uneven spread is a stark map of the collapse's impact. In Mesopotamia, the cuneiform script, written by a powerful and enduring class of temple and palace scribes, continued without interruption. In Egypt, hieroglyphic writing survived, though its use became more restricted to religious and monumental contexts. The survival of these literacies highlights a crucial point: writing does not exist in a vacuum. It is a technology sustained by stable, wealthy institutions that can train scribes, produce writing materials, and create a need for permanent records. Where those institutions collapsed completely, literacy often died with them. This dramatic contrast forces us to see knowledge as a fragile ecosystem. A writing system is not just a set of symbols, it is a living tradition passed from teacher to student, a thread connecting generations. When palaces burn and societies fragment, that thread can be cut. The loss of literacy in Greece and Anatolia was not a conscious choice to abandon writing, but a catastrophic failure of the social structures that made writing necessary and possible. It was a return to a smaller, more immediate world, where memory resided in the spoken word and the community's shared stories, not in clay tablets or palace archives. In that silence, however, new forms of remembering and organizing were slowly, painfully being born. What tools would these new societies forge to replace what was lost? The artifacts left behind tell a story of a world growing smaller. In the layers of earth that mark the years after the Great Fires, archaeologists notice a striking change. The exquisite pottery of the Mycenaean palaces, with its vibrant depictions of octopuses and charioteers, vanishes. In its place for generations appears simpler, plainer ware, decorated with just a few geometric lines. The technical skill required to throw those fine, thin-walled vessels and to fire them in complex kilns seems to have been lost or was no longer a priority. The same pattern appears in stone. The knowledge of constructing those monumental cyclopean walls, of corbelling arches and carving grand lion gates, faded from memory. Building projects shrank in scale to what a local village could manage. The trade in luxury goods, ivory, amber, intricate jewelry dried up almost completely. The material world became poorer, less connected, and far more local. This shift is often called a regression, and in a purely technical sense, it was. The elaborate, specialized crafts that thrived under palace patronage could not survive when the palaces were gone. The artists and engineers who practiced them were either dispersed or their skills became irrelevant in a new world focused on a single, urgent task: basic survival. Life reoriented itself around subsistence. Without the guarantee of grain from a central storehouse, every community had to become self-sufficient. People grew their own food, made their own simple tools, and produced their own basic pottery. The grand, interconnected machine of the Bronze Age had broken down into countless small, independent workshops, each focused on meeting its own immediate needs. To label this period solely as a dark age of barbarism, however, misses its essential human reality. This simplification was not a descent into chaos, but a difficult, pragmatic adaptation to harsh new conditions. When the complex system that clothed and fed you collapses, you do not mourn the loss of fine art, you learned to mend your own tunic and till your own field. The focus turned inward toward family, clan, and the immediate village. This was a necessary narrowing of horizons, a conservation of energy and resources. In this stripped-down existence, the old hierarchies based on palace bureaucracy meant nothing. Social structures likely became more egalitarian out of sheer necessity. Leadership would have been based on who could provide, protect, and organize on a local scale, not on a distant royal bloodline. This technological and cultural step back, as painful as it was, did something profoundly important. It cleared the ground. It broke the monopoly of the old system. The Bronze Age economy was rigid, controlled from the top, and utterly dependent on long-distance trade for its essential tin. The collapse shattered that model. In its place, communities began to experiment with a more accessible, democratic metal, iron. Iron ore is far more common than copper or tin, found in almost every region. The technology to work it is harder, requiring higher temperatures, but it does not rely on fragile international supply chains. A village could potentially source and smelt its own iron. The widespread adoption of iron did not happen immediately after the collapse. It took centuries to perfect, but the conditions for its rise were created by the collapse itself. The bronze-based system, with all its sophistication, had to fail for the Iron Age to begin. Sometimes progress does not move in a straight line. A forest fire, devastating in the moment, clears out the old, dense canopy and allows sunlight to reach the forest floor, prompting new kinds of growth. The simplification after the Bronze Age collapse was a societal fire. It burned away an old, intricate world, forcing humanity to return to fundamentals. From that hardened, localized foundation, new ideas, new social contracts, and new technologies would slowly, tentatively begin to grow. The quiet villages of the so-called Dark Age were not empty of innovation. They were quietly nurturing the seeds of a completely different future. And one of the most significant of those seeds was a new way of organizing human speech, a technology of thought that would prove more durable than any palace wall. The key to the New World was not found in a royal treasury, but in the most common of stones. Iron ore is not a rare treasure. It is one of the most abundant metals in the Earth's crust. In the shattered landscape left by the collapse, this simple fact became revolutionary. The old Bronze Age system was like a delicate, globalized assembly line, requiring copper from Cyprus and tin from distant Afghanistan to function. When that line was severed, the assembly line stopped forever. Communities could no longer wait for a king's merchant to deliver the essential alloy. They had to look to the hills and streams around them, to the rust-colored rocks they had once ignored. This was not an immediate technological triumph, but a slow, gritty process of adaptation. The knowledge of working iron had existed for centuries, but it was often a specialized, almost mystical craft. The Hittites, in their heyday, had prized iron for ceremonial objects, calling it the metal from heaven in their texts, valuing it more highly than gold. But their techniques were closely guarded secrets of the palace. The collapse scattered those secrets and, more importantly, created the desperate need for a new, accessible material. Smelting iron is a more demanding process than working bronze. Bronze melts at a relatively low temperature and can be cast into molds like pouring liquid into a shape. Iron requires a much hotter, more controlled fire to separate the metal from the ore, resulting in a spongy mass called a bloom that then must be repeatedly heated and hammered to drive out impurities. It is a labor-intensive, skill-demanding craft. So why did it win? Because its raw material was everywhere. A village near deposits of bog iron or certain rocks could, with great effort and experimentation, become self-sufficient. They were no longer hostages to a fragile international market. The transition was gradual. For a long time, iron items remained rare and often of poorer quality than good bronze. Early iron swords might not have been much better and were sometimes worse than their bronze counterparts, but as techniques improved through relentless trial and error, the advantages became undeniable. A properly worked iron blade could take a sharper, harder edge and was more durable. It could be repaired by a local smith, not sent back to a palace workshop. Most importantly, it could be produced without asking permission from a distant king. This shift democratized metal in a profound way. In the Bronze Age, control of the tin and copper trade meant control of the military and the economy. Power was concentrated in the hands of the palace elites who managed the supply. The Iron Age broke that monopoly. Now, a charismatic leader in a hilltop village could arm a band of followers with weapons forged from local materials. Power began to diffuse, moving away from the few centralized capitals that survived and into the hands of countless smaller chiefdoms and emerging city-states. The rise of iron was not the cause of the collapse, but its most enduring consequence. It was the practical answer to a world that had lost its connections. The old, top-down system of bronze had died with the palaces. From its ashes, a more resilient, localized, and ultimately more flexible age was hammered into being, one forge fire at a time. While inland empires crumbled, the coast offered a different kind of refuge. In the narrow strip of land between the mountains and the sea, the old Canaanite cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos faced the same fires and fear. Their walls were breached, their wealth plundered. But here, something vital survived the inferno, a deep, generational knowledge of the waves. With the great imperial powers now gone or weakened, these battered ports found themselves suddenly, starkly free. There was no Egyptian viceroy to command them, no Hittite overlord to demand tribute. In that terrifying vacuum, they made a choice. They would not rebuild the old world. They would invent a new one. They became the Phoenicians, and their response to collapse was to turn their greatest vulnerability into their supreme strength. They looked to the open sea. The Phoenicians did not sail as conquerors seeking land, but as merchants seeking connection. They became the master rebuilders of the Mediterranean's shattered nervous system. With incredible daring, they pushed their sleek, cedar-built ships farther than any palace-sponsored fleet had ever dared to go. They sailed beyond the sunset, establishing trading posts on the rocky coasts of Sicily and Sardinia. They ventured past the Strait of Gibraltar, a place they called the Pillars of Melkart, and founded Cadiz in southern Spain, a gateway to the Atlantic and the tin mines of distant Cornwall. On the North African coast, they planted the seed of a city called Carthage, a name that would one day shake Rome itself. Their voyages were not military campaigns, but commercial expeditions. They traded vibrant purple dye extracted from sea snails, precious cedar timber, exquisite glassware, and finely crafted metalwork. In return, they brought back silver, tin, and cultural ideas from every shore they touched. They were the networkers of the early Iron Age, stitching the Mediterranean back together with threads of commerce instead of imperial decree. Their most profound innovation, however, was not carried in their ships' holds, but in the minds of their sailors and merchants. They perfected a revolutionary tool for thought, the alphabet. Earlier Canaanite scripts had begun this simplification, but the Phoenicians refined it into a system of just 22 consonant symbols. It was stunningly efficient. Unlike the thousands of complex cuneiform signs used in Mesopotamia or the hundreds of Egyptian hieroglyphs, this alphabet could be learned in a matter of weeks, not a lifetime of scribble training. This was not writing for kings and gods alone. This was writing for practicality. A merchant in Tyre could use it to record a cargo manifest, send a letter to his agent in Cyprus, or draft a trade contract. It was a technology of commerce and communication, designed for speed and clarity in a fast-moving world. The impact of this simple set of symbols is almost impossible to overstate. As Phoenician ships crisscrossed the Mediterranean, their alphabet traveled with them. It was adopted and adapted by the Greeks, who added vowels to the system, creating a script that would record the epics of Homer and the philosophies of Plato. From the Greeks, it passed to the Etruscans and then the Romans, evolving into the Latin alphabet that you are reading right now. Every word written in English, Spanish, French, or Italian flows from this Phoenician source. Their greatest legacy was not an empire of stone, but an empire of the mind, a tool for storing and transmitting human thought that would outlast any monument. The phoenix is a mythical bird that rises from its own ashes, reborn in fire. The Phoenician cities lived this metaphor. They did not merely endure the collapse, they metabolized it. The end of the top-heavy, palace-controlled Bronze Age system created the space they needed. Without giant empires overshadowing them, they could operate with agility and independence. Their story demonstrates that collapse, while devastating, is not always an end. It can be a brutal, unplanned moment of creative destruction. It clears away rigid, aging structures and allows for new, more adaptable models to emerge from the survivors. The Phoenicians show us that sometimes the most influential civilizations are not those that conquer the most land, but those that best learn to navigate a changed world. While the Phoenicians looked to the sea, a quieter revolution was unfolding in the inland hills. Far from the burned ports and the old trade routes, the rocky highlands of Canaan saw a sudden bloom of life. Archaeological surveys reveal hundreds of small, new villages appearing almost overnight in the archaeological record, beginning in the 12th century BC. These were not grand cities, they were clusters of simple, stone-built houses, with cisterns carved into the bedrock and terraces cut into the slopes for olive trees and grain. This is the material signature of the earliest Israelite communities, emerging directly in the shadow of the collapse. Who were these people? The question has fueled a century of scholarly debate, and the answer is likely a mosaic, not a single origin story. One compelling theory suggests they were displaced Canaanites. As the lowland city-states like Hazor and Megiddo were destroyed, their populations fled the chaos, seeking refuge in the more defensible but less desirable highlands. Another theory points to groups of pastoral nomads, shepherds who had always moved through the margins, deciding to settle down and farm as the old political order disintegrated. The most likely scenario is a fusion, a mixing of local Canaanite farmers, fleeing townspeople, and itinerant herders, all drawn together in a difficult new environment. They were united less by a common bloodline and more by a common circumstance, the need for mutual survival in a world that had just come apart. The collapse created the essential condition for this experiment, a power vacuum. For centuries, the Egyptian Empire had been the dominant force in Canaan, maintaining garrison towns and demanding tribute. The end of the Bronze Age saw that imperial grip finally slip away. The pharaohs, struggling to defend their own core, withdrew. Suddenly, there was no distant overlord to tax the harvest or draft soldiers. This newfound autonomy was hard-won, a freedom born from the rubble of the old system. In this space, free from the religious and political structures of the Egyptian or Canaanite elites, something profoundly new began to take shape. These highland communities developed a religious tradition that would change the world, a focus on a single, universal deity. The origins of biblical monotheism are complex and gradual, but the social context of its early development is clear. It emerged among a community of highland farmers, not in the palace of a king. Their faith emphasized a direct covenant between the people and their God, a relationship that did not require the mediation of a royal priesthood or the endorsement of an empire. This was a portable, resilient idea, perfectly suited to a people without a king or a capital, building their identity from the ground up. The story of the Bronze Age collapse, therefore, is not just a story of endings. It is also the essential backdrop for a monumental beginning. The political fragmentation and social upheaval that toppled empires created a unique laboratory in the Canaanite highlands. Out of the mixture of displaced peoples and new freedoms, the early Israelite society coalesced. From these rustic villages would eventually grow the biblical kingdoms of Israel and Judah, whose stories, laws, and spiritual concepts would deeply influence much of human civilization. This demonstrates a powerful historical pattern. When great centralized powers fragment, the periphery often becomes the cradle of radical innovation. The silence left by fallen giants is filled by new voices, speaking new ideas into being. The songs that rose from the ashes were not of fire, but of heroes. For centuries after the Mycenaean palaces fell, the people of Greece lived in a world without writing. Yet, in that profound silence, memory did not die, it was transformed into sound. Around campfires and in village gatherings, bards recited tales of a magnificent, bygone age. Their words passed from one generation to the next like a precious heirloom. These were the raw materials from which, centuries later, a master poet would forge the foundational texts of Western literature, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The world Homer describes is a shimmering, half-remembered reflection of the late Bronze Age, a poetic echo of the very civilization that had collapsed into the darkness from which he sang. His epics are not history books, but they are history's ghost, a cultural memory shaped entirely by the cataclysm. Think of the world Homer portrays. It is a society of mighty warrior kings like Agamemnon and Achilles, ruling from palaces like golden Mycenae and sandy Pylos. They lead armies in gleaming bronze armor, fight from chariots, and amass fabulous wealth through plunder and trade. This is not an invention, it is a folk memory of the actual Mycenaean world, preserved in oral poetry long after the scribes and their linear B tablets had turned to dust. The Trojan War itself may be a magnified echo of the kind of interstate warfare that likely contributed to the system's final unraveling, but the poems also pulse with the violence of an ending. They are filled with the sacking of cities, the burning of strongholds, and the desperate, wandering journeys of heroes trying to find their way home. The Odyssey, in particular, reads like a metaphor for the entire post-collapse era, a long and perilous voyage through a shattered world, seeking a homeland that may have changed beyond recognition. What is truly remarkable is the timing of their composition. Homer is believed to have woven these oral traditions into their monumental written form in the 8th century BC, just as Greece was finally re-emerging from its long isolation. New city-states were forming, trade was reviving, and a new alphabet, adapted from the Phoenicians, was making literacy possible again. At this precise moment of rebirth, Greek civilization looked back and gave itself an origin story. It did not choose a tale about peaceful farmers or wise lawmakers. It chose an epic of monumental war, tragic pride, and a glorious world lost. The trauma of the collapse became the bedrock of Greek identity. The heroes of the Trojan War, their values and their flaws, provided a shared cultural reference point for everyone from Athenian philosophers to Spartan soldiers. This reveals a profound truth about how societies process catastrophe. When a civilization fractures, its physical infrastructure may be destroyed and its writing forgotten, but its stories can survive, mutating and gaining power in the retelling. The Mycenaean collapse was a real historical event that erased a complex society. Yet, by passing through the crucible of oral tradition, it was transmuted into myth. That myth then served a vital purpose for the new world that followed. It provided a sense of depth and destiny, a connection to a grander past that justified present ambitions. The Greeks defined their own emerging age in the reflected glory of a lost heroic one, a pattern we see again and again in human history. The legacy of the collapse, therefore, is not just in the ruins we dig up, but in the stories we tell about ourselves, stories that give meaning to both our triumphs and our deepest losses. The old royal highways were gone, but new paths opened in their place. The trade networks that slowly re-knitted the Mediterranean together in the Iron Age were not a restoration of what had been lost, they were a complete reinvention. The Bronze Age system was a closed circuit, a series of elite handshakes between palaces. Kings exchanged what they called gifts, lavish shipments of gold, ivory, and fine textiles, all carefully recorded by scribes to maintain diplomatic balance and prestige. It was commerce in the service of power. The new Iron Age model turned this entirely on its head. Power now flowed from commerce itself. This shift was embodied by the Phoenician merchant in his cedar ship, sailing not on a pharaoh's orders, but on his own account, seeking profit in every port. Trade was no longer a royal monopoly. It became a competitive, open market. City-states like Tyre, Corinth, and later Athens thrived not because they commanded vast hinterlands, but because they mastered the sea lanes and the art of the deal. This was a democratization of exchange, where wealth could be built by initiative and risk, not just by birthright. The very nature of the goods being traded told the story of this new world. In the Bronze Age, the focus was on prestige materials and military essentials, bronze and luxury items for the elite. The Iron Age saw the rise of commodities for the many. Two liquids became the oil of this new economy: wine and olive oil. These were not just foods, they were industries. In Greece, farmers terraced hillsides to cultivate olive groves and vineyards on a scale never before seen. They produced not for local consumption alone, but for export. They stored their oil and wine in distinctive clay jars, amphorae, which became the shipping containers of the ancient world. Archaeologists can trace the spread of Greek culture by following these pottery fragments across the Mediterranean, from the coast of France to the Black Sea. Alongside them sailed mass-produced fine pottery, decorated with intricate black and red figures depicting myths and daily life, desirable goods for a growing middle class of merchants and prosperous farmers. This was trade built on popular consumption, a sign of a more broadly prosperous and connected society. The map of commerce itself stretched and changed shape. The Bronze Age network had been concentrated in the eastern Mediterranean, linking Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant, and the Aegean. The Iron Age gaze turned decisively westward. Following the Phoenician lead, Greek traders and colonists sailed beyond the familiar, establishing settlements in southern Italy, Sicily, and the coast of modern-day France. These were not mere trading posts, but full-fledged new cities, replicas of the homeland that created permanent bridges between cultures. This westward expansion opened up new sources of grain, metals, and slaves, while spreading Greek art, architecture, and ideas. The central Mediterranean was transformed from a periphery into a vibrant crossroads, a melting pot that would eventually feed the rise of Rome. This new commercial ecosystem was inherently more dynamic and resilient than the old one. It was a network of many nodes, not a hub-and-spoke model dependent on a few great capitals. If one city fell into conflict or a trade route was disrupted, others could adapt and fill the gap. The competition between merchants and city-states drove innovation in ship design, navigation, and coinage, which first appeared in this period to simplify all these new transactions. The economic interdependence that emerged was fundamentally different, based on market demand and supply chains rather than royal whim. A farmer in Attica could prosper by pressing olive oil for a customer in Egypt he would never meet, connected by a chain of merchants and sailors. This laid the absolute groundwork for the commercial economies of the classical world, for the bustling agora of Athens and the vast trade networks of the Roman Empire. The lesson here is profound. A system does not have to be rebuilt exactly as it was. The collapse shattered a rigid, top-down economic model, and from its fragments, a more flexible, diverse, and energetic system assembled itself. It was less orderly but far more creative, The drive to connect, to exchange, and to prosper is a powerful human force, and when old structures fail, that force will always find new channels. It raises a final, reflective question about the legacy of such a transformative event. How do we, looking back across 3,000 years, measure the true cost and the unexpected gain of a world remade? What is the ultimate balance sheet of the Bronze Age collapse? The chariot was more than a weapon, it was a symbol of an entire social order. In the late Bronze Age, the battlefield belonged to an elite few. A war chariot was a masterpiece of expensive technology, a lightweight platform of wood and leather pulled by a pair of specially trained horses. Its crew, a driver and a warrior armed with a composite bow or javelins, represented a staggering investment. Only a king or a great noble could afford the horses, the skilled craftsmen, and the years of training required. This created a warrior aristocracy, a class whose power was literally mounted on wheels. Their dominance on the flat plains of Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia seemed unshakable, a divine right cemented in bronze. But the world that emerged from the collapse was not built for chariots. The new political landscape was one of fractured territories, rugged highlands, and fortified hilltop villages, terrain where the expensive chariot was clumsy and vulnerable. The military revolution that followed was as much about geography as it was about metal. In this broken world, the advantage shifted to the man on foot. Lighter, more mobile infantry could navigate rocky slopes, set ambushes in wooded passes, and defend steep citadels far more effectively than a chariot corps ever could. This shift was powerfully embodied by the very agents of the collapse. The reliefs at Medinet Habu in Egypt, showing the battle against the Sea Peoples, are strikingly clear on this point. While Pharaoh Ramesses III grandly rides his chariot, the invaders are depicted overwhelmingly as foot soldiers and sailors. They fight in dense packs with thrusting spears and round shields, a style of warfare that was inexpensive, adaptable, and devastatingly effective against the old model. They were not an aristocratic corps but a mobile force of many, and their success signaled a profound change. The spread of iron weaponry accelerated this democratization of force. While a bronze sword required controlled access to distant tin, an iron spearhead could be forged from local ore. Weapons became cheaper and more widely available. A charismatic leader could now arm a band of followers without the blessing of a palace armory. Warfare was no longer the exclusive sport of a chariot-riding nobility. It became a tool for new men, for rising city-states, and for communities defending their own land. This transformation in how wars were fought inevitably transformed who held power. The social prestige of the old chariot elite crumbled alongside their military relevance. Their role was usurped by a broader segment of society, those who fought on foot because it was practical and who demanded a say in return for their service. This new logic of collective defense found its purest expression centuries later in the hills of Greece with the rise of the hoplite. The hoplite was not a royal retainer or a mercenary, but typically a land-owning farmer. He provided his own panoply, a bronze helmet, breastplate, greaves, a large round shield, and a long thrusting spear. His strength did not lie in individual heroics, but in his place within the phalanx, a tightly packed formation where each man's shield protected the comrade to his left. This was an army of citizens, its effectiveness dependent on discipline, cohesion, and a shared stake in the community's survival. The phalanx was the military expression of a new social contract, one where political rights began to extend to those who stood in the battle line. The glorious, individualistic champion in his chariot had given way to the anonymous citizen soldier in the ranks, a shift that would define the classical world and echo down to our own concepts of civic duty. The collapse did not just change what armies used, it fundamentally changed who armies were, and in doing so, it reshaped the very idea of where power should reside. The king was no longer the sun around which all life orbited. The most profound legacy of the collapse was not found in new metals or trade routes, but in a radical reimagining of the social contract itself. For centuries, the ideological heart of the Bronze Age was the concept of the god-king, a ruler who served as the sole, divine conduit between heaven and earth. He collected the harvest, stored it in his palace granaries, and redistributed it to the people, feeding soldiers, artisans, and priests. This was not just an economy, it was a cosmology, a complete system where political power, religious authority, and economic survival were fused into one unbreakable whole. The palace was the engine of the world. When that world collapsed, when the granaries stayed empty and the gods seemed silent, the entire justification for that system evaporated. The old ideology of divine kingship shattered along with the palace walls, leaving societies with a terrifying but liberating question: if not a king, then who are we, and how shall we live together? The answers that emerged were as varied as the landscapes themselves, each a unique experiment in collective life. In the rocky valleys of Greece, the answer took the form of the polis, the city-state. This was not a restoration of the Mycenaean palace complex, with its single ruler and vast bureaucracy. The polis was something fundamentally different, a community of citizens, though we must remember this citizenship was initially limited to free, adult males with property. Its center was not a royal throne room, but the agora, an open space for public assembly, debate, and market exchange. The concept of citizenship, however exclusive, introduced a revolutionary idea that political identity and rights could be derived from membership in a community, not from subservience to a monarch. The laws of the city, like those famously codified by Solon in Athens, applied to everyone within that community, creating a framework of shared responsibility. This was a dramatic shift from a world where law was the word of the king. The Greek city-state was often fractious, competitive, and fraught with internal conflict, but it was also dynamic, fostering an environment where philosophy, drama, and participatory governance could take root. It was a system built not on vertical command, but on horizontal, if often tense, negotiation among peers. Meanwhile, on the Phoenician coast, a different model of power emerged, one shaped by the logic of commerce. Cities like Tyre and Sidon were not ruled by a single divine monarch, but by councils of wealthy merchant families, an oligarchy. Their legitimacy flowed not from a claim of heavenly mandate, but from economic success and naval prowess. Governance was a practical matter of managing trade fleets, securing treaties with foreign partners, and ensuring the city's harbor remained open for business. This created a pragmatic, outward-looking political culture focused on stability and profit rather than imperial glory or monumental construction. The Phoenician system was less concerned with grand ideologies of citizenship and more with the efficient administration of wealth. It proved to be incredibly resilient and adaptable, allowing these city-states to thrive for centuries without the need for a unifying king, their influence spreading through networks of trade rather than conquest. In the highlands of Canaan, the early Israelite communities presented yet another solution. In the wake of the collapse, they initially organized themselves as a loose confederation of tribes, bound together by a shared covenant with their deity and a collective memory of liberation. Leadership was often charismatic and temporary, arising in times of crisis, as seen in the biblical figures of the judges. This was a deeply egalitarian impulse among the tribes, a suspicion of centralized kingship which was viewed, in their early texts, as a rejection of divine rule and a copying of the oppressive nations around them. Even when the pressures of the Iron Age world eventually pushed them to adopt a monarchy under Saul and David, it remained a kingship constrained by prophetic critique and law, never attaining the absolute, divine status of a pharaoh or a Hittite emperor. Their identity was rooted in law and covenant first, and in a king second. This explosion of political experimentation reveals the true creative power unleashed by the collapse. The monolithic, top-down model of the Bronze Age palace had been a cage as much as a cradle. Its destruction forced humanity to brainstorm, to try out different answers to the eternal problems of governance, belonging, and justice. From these experiments flowed the political vocabulary of the classical world, ideas of citizenship, law, republic, and covenant that would echo for millennia. The collapse did not just change what people fought with or traded, it changed the very idea of what a society could be. It asked, and for a fleeting, formative moment, it allowed for many different answers. This leads us to a final, overarching reflection. When we step back and view this entire arc, from glittering interconnected age to ashes and then to a dozen new sprouts, what is the ultimate meaning of this 3,000-year-old catastrophe? What does the collapse of the Bronze Age truly tell us about the nature of civilization itself? The story of the collapse is not written in a single book, but pieced together from a million fragments. To understand how we know what we know, you must step into the trench with the archaeologist, where history is not read, but literally unearthed, one careful layer at a time. The most fundamental tool is stratigraphy, the science of soil layers. Imagine a slice of earth at an ancient city like Ugarit. At the bottom, you might find the foundations of the first settlement. As you move upward, layer by layer, you see floors of houses, streets paved and repaved, each representing a period of occupation. Then you hit a dramatic change, a thick, continuous band of ash, charcoal, and collapsed, burned mud brick. This is a destruction layer, a moment frozen in time. By meticulously recording the sequence of these layers, archaeologists can build a relative chronology, understanding which events came before and after others across an entire region. It is the physical timeline of a civilization's life and death. But how do you date these layers? One of the most reliable clocks is something as humble as a broken pot. Pottery seriation is the detective work of style. Over time, the shape, decoration, and manufacturing techniques of everyday ceramics evolve in predictable ways. By studying these changes at well-dated sites, like those in Egypt with recorded pharaohs, archaeologists create a reference sequence. Then, when they find that same distinctive style of pottery in a destruction layer in Greece or Anatolia, they can synchronize the timelines. If Mycenaean pottery from a specific period is found in the same ash layer as Cypriot pottery of a known date, it tells us those two places were connected at that moment, and that their shared moment of destruction happened at roughly the same time. It is a web of connections built from shattered clay. The written word, when it survives, adds a powerful voice to this physical evidence. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu are not just art, they are a primary source, a royal press release from the front lines of the crisis. Similarly, the Amarna letters and the last tablet from Ugarit provide direct testimony, the fears and negotiations of the people who lived through the unraveling. Yet texts must be read with care, as they often carry the bias of their authors, celebrating victories or placing blame. The archaeologist's job is to cross-reference the boastful inscription with the silent evidence in the ground, asking if the story of a great victory matches the evidence of a city thoroughly sacked and abandoned. Today, the detective's toolkit has expanded into the realm of hard science. Stable isotope analysis of human bones and teeth can reveal an individual's diet and even where they grew up. By studying the chemical signatures locked in remains, scientists can identify if a group found in a coastal city were locals who ate a marine diet or migrants from inland regions. This can help trace movements of populations, perhaps even identifying the origins of some of those enigmatic sea peoples. Meanwhile, palynology, the study of ancient pollen grains preserved in lakebed sediments, acts as a botanical recorder. A sudden shift in the pollen record from tree pollen to drought-resistant shrubs provides a clear, localized signal of environmental change, confirming the climatic stresses suggested by broader models. The ultimate goal is not to find a single smoking gun, but to assemble a mosaic where every piece, the layer of ash, the style of a pot, the plea in a letter, and the chemistry of a bone, supports and clarifies the others. This is why our understanding of the Bronze Age collapse is always evolving. A new core drilled from a seabed, a fresh analysis of tooth enamel from a forgotten burial. These can refine the picture, adding nuance or challenging old assumptions. It is a reminder that history is not a static list of facts, but an ongoing investigation, a conversation between the past and the present, conducted with trowels, microscopes, and an endless curiosity about how our world came to be. That same vulnerability to a single point of failure echoes in our own world today. Our global civilization is a masterpiece of interconnection, a web far more intricate than anything the Bronze Age could have conceived. We source microchips from one continent, assemble devices on another, and depend on digital networks that span the globe in milliseconds. This creates incredible efficiency and wealth, but it also mirrors that ancient fragility. A disruption in a key shipping lane, a political crisis in a resource-rich region, or a pandemic that halts movement can send shockwaves through the entire system, revealing how tightly our prosperity is woven to the smooth flow of goods and information. The lesson of the tin trade is not that trade is bad, but that resilience requires options. When a civilization's essential needs depend on a single, fragile thread, the entire tapestry is at risk. Our challenge is to build networks with redundancy, to diversify supply chains and energy sources, so that a break in one link does not threaten the whole chain. The Bronze Age reminds us that complexity without resilience is a precarious achievement. Another parallel whispers to us from those ancient lakebed sediments and ice cores. The 3.2 kiloyear event was a slow-moving, immense pressure that reshaped human destiny. Today, we face our own profound environmental shifts, a changing climate that stresses agricultural systems, alters water availability, and intensifies extreme weather. The ancient kingdoms did not cause their drought, but they were utterly unprepared for its consequences. Their centralized systems, designed for stability, could not adapt to such a fundamental change in the rules of survival. For us, the warning is not about an identical fate, but about the undeniable relationship between environmental stability and social stability. Scarcity breeds tension. When resources become uncertain, the social contracts that hold communities together can strain, just as they did when the Hittite grain ships stopped arriving. The historical record suggests that environmental stress rarely destroys a society on its own, but it acts as a threat multiplier, amplifying every other weakness, from economic inequality to political mistrust. This ancient case study pushes us to think in terms of buffers and adaptability. How do we design our food systems, our cities, and our economies to be more flexible in the face of change? How do we strengthen the social cohesion that allows communities to cooperate rather than fracture under pressure? The collapse was ultimately a systems collapse, a cascade where economic, environmental, and social failures reinforced each other. No single disaster toppled those kingdoms. It was the combination, the perfect storm. Our modern world, for all its advances, is not immune to similar cascading risks. A financial crisis can trigger political unrest, which can hinder responses to a public health challenge, which can further strain economic recovery. The interconnectedness that defines our age can also accelerate crises. This is not a prediction of doom, but a powerful argument for holistic thinking. It encourages us to look for the weak links not just in our supply chains, but in our social fabric and our relationship with the natural world. The end of the Bronze Age was not an extinction. It was a brutal, transformative filtering. From its ashes rose the seeds of the classical world, the alphabet, iron, new forms of community. This is perhaps the most vital lesson of all. Collapse, when it happens, is not always a full stop. It can be a semicolon, a painful transition that clears away rigid structures and creates space for innovation. The survivors were not those who clung hardest to the old ways, but those who adapted, who looked to the hills, to the sea, or to new metals. Their story is ultimately one of human resilience. It tells us that the value of studying such a distant catastrophe is not to feed anxiety, but to cultivate foresight. It asks us to examine the pillars of our own civilization with clear eyes, to invest in diversification, sustainability, and equity not as luxuries, but as the fundamental buffers against history's inevitable storms. By understanding how a world can come apart, we gain a deeper appreciation for what it takes to hold one together. A family does not abandon its ancestral land without a powerful reason. The movements we call migrations are never simple journeys. They are profound calculations of desperation and hope. For the people of the late Bronze Age, the decision to move was often forced upon them by the very earth beneath their feet. Years of failed rains meant empty fields and empty stomachs. A community facing starvation had few choices: stay and face hardship, or gather what they could and seek a new beginning elsewhere. These are the push factors, the environmental and social pressures that compel people to leave. But there is always a pull as well. The glittering cities of Egypt, the wealthy ports of the Levant, these beacons of relative stability and surplus would have shone like magnets across a darkening landscape. The movement was not mindless wandering. It was a targeted flow from areas of scarcity to perceived areas of abundance. This reframes the entire narrative of the Sea Peoples. They were likely not a unified barbarian horde with a singular goal of destruction. Instead, they were a composite, a cascading series of migrations set in motion by the wider collapse. Some groups may have been displaced Anatolians, others fleeing the drought-stricken Aegean, still others from the fracturing societies of the central Mediterranean. They moved along the coasts and rivers, the ancient highways, and when they encountered the fortified borders of stressed kingdoms, what began as a search for new land could quickly turn into violent confrontation. Their migration was both a cause of further instability and a direct consequence of the initial systemic failures. It created a devastating feedback loop. Displacement led to conflict, which created more refugees, who in turn displaced others, a chain reaction of human movement that overwhelmed the old world's capacity to absorb it. Modern archaeology has had to unlearn a tempting but misleading shorthand, the idea that pots equal people. For a long time, the sudden appearance of a new style of pottery in a region was taken as clear evidence of a new ethnic group moving in. But culture is far more fluid than that. Pottery styles can spread through trade, through imitation, or through the migration of just a few skilled potters who teach their craft to locals. A new cooking pot does not necessarily mean a wholesale invasion. This complexity forces us to see migration not as the replacement of one population by another, but as a process of mixing, adaptation, and cultural exchange, even in times of great stress. Some migrants may have been absorbed peacefully into new communities, others may have clashed violently with residents, and many likely did a bit of both, negotiating their place in a changing world. This perspective transforms migration from an anomalous, catastrophic event into a constant and recurring force in human history. From the Germanic tribes pressing against the Roman frontier to the great movements across the steppes of Asia, the story of humanity is in large part a story of people in motion. These movements are fundamental drivers of change, carrying new ideas, technologies, and genes across continents. They are not interruptions of a static historical norm, they are the norm. Understanding the migrations of the Bronze Age collapse not as a unique mystery, but as part of this deep pattern allows us to analyze both past and present with greater clarity. It reminds us that when the environmental or political foundations of a region tremble, people will move. The direction of that movement, and whether it leads to conflict or integration, depends on the resilience and the openness of the worlds they leave and the worlds they seek. This ancient lesson in human geography asks us to look beyond labels of invaders or refugees and to see the universal pressures that have always set families and entire cultures on the road. A single comet strike makes for a gripping story, but history is rarely so simple. The dramatic downfall of Bronze Age civilizations has, over the years, attracted explanations that feel more at home in a summer blockbuster than an archaeology journal. You might have heard theories of ancient nuclear wars inspired by cryptic passages in old texts, or of a cataclysmic comet impact that instantly wiped cultures from the map. These ideas are compelling because they offer a clear villain, a single, spectacular moment of doom. The truth, however, is both less cinematic and far more revealing. The evidence points not to a sudden, clean cut, but to a prolonged and messy unraveling that took generations to complete. Think of it not as a light switch being flipped off, but as a complex machine slowly grinding to a halt, its gears seizing up one after another over the course of 50 or even 100 years. This timescale is written in the layers of destruction at city after city, which show periods of rebuilding, abandonment, and resettlement, not a single, synchronized firestorm. A comet impact or a sudden, continent-wide war would leave a very specific, simultaneous signature in the geological and archaeological record, a layer of ash and iridium or evidence of uniform conquest. That blanket signature simply does not exist. What we find instead is a patchwork, a staggered pattern of crisis where one region falters, then another, as the shockwaves of failure travel along those fragile networks of trade and communication. This does not make the reality any less tragic or transformative. If anything, a slow-motion collapse is in many ways more haunting. It means people lived through the decline. They experienced the growing dread as trade goods vanished, as familiar diplomatic partners fell silent, and as the rains failed year after year. They made difficult choices to flee, to fight, or to try and hold on, all while the world they knew incrementally dissolved around them. This human scale of the disaster, filled with uncertainty and adaptation, is where the real historical lesson resides. The allure of the apocalyptic myth is understandable. It provides a neat, external cause that absolves the civilizations themselves of any responsibility. It is easier to blame the stars than to examine the intricate flaws within our own systems. But by championing the more rigorous, interconnected explanation, we gain something far more valuable, a mirror. We see how environmental stress, economic interdependence, and social fragility can combine in a perfect storm. This story compels us to think in terms of systems and resilience, not just of heroes and villains. It asks us to look at the long arc of consequences, not just the flashpoint of crisis. And in doing so, the true narrative of the Bronze Age collapse becomes not a simplistic tale of destruction, but a profound, millennia-old case study in the vulnerability and adaptability of human civilization. The fear of a world unmade has haunted the human imagination ever since. Long after the last embers cooled in the palaces of Mycenaean and Hattusa, the memory of that great unraveling continued to echo, not in history books, but in the stories we told to explain our own fragile place in the universe. One of the most profound of these stories is the biblical Exodus. While its historicity is a complex and separate debate, many scholars note that the narrative's core themes align powerfully with the atmosphere of the late Bronze Age collapse. It is a story of a people escaping the grip of a mighty empire, a journey through chaos, and the forging of a new identity in the aftermath of systemic failure. Whether it records specific events or captures the collective trauma of an era, the Exodus myth embodies the profound human experience of watching old orders fall and struggling toward a promised land. It translates historical upheaval into a foundational spiritual drama, proving that cataclysm can give birth to meaning. Centuries later, the artists of the Romantic era were gripped by a similar awe in the face of fallen grandeur. Painters like Thomas Cole and John Martin did not depict the Bronze Age directly, but they captured its emotional shadow. Their vast, tumultuous canvases show nature reclaiming broken temples and toppled statues, with tiny human figures dwarfed by the ruins of their own ambition. These works, titled The Course of Empire or The Fall of Nineveh, are not about a specific historical event, but about the universal cycle they perceived: rise, zenith, decay, and oblivion. The Romantic fascination with sublime decay was in part a meditation on the same truth the collapse reveals, that no civilization, no matter how mighty, is permanent. The artists channeled the ancient mystery into a visual language of warning and wonder, reminding a newly industrializing world of the ghosts that sleep beneath all human achievement. This archetype of the lost golden age and the great catastrophe flows directly into the bedrock of modern fantasy. When J.R.R. Tolkien, a scholar intimately familiar with ancient myths and languages, constructed the history of Middle-earth, he embedded a pattern of glorious realms that fall, from sunken Numenor to the faded kingdoms of Arna and Gondor. The sense of a deeper, more wondrous past now in ruins is central to the genre's atmosphere. Our blockbuster films and epic video games are filled with these echoes, ancient advanced civilizations destroyed by their own hubris or a forgotten calamity, leaving behind only fragments of magic or technology. We are drawn to these narratives not because we know the details of the Bronze Age collapse, but because we feel its pattern in our bones. It is a cultural ghost, a template for storytelling that speaks to our deepest anxieties about the stability of our own world and a lingering nostalgia for a half-remembered age of wonders. The collapse, therefore, accomplished something beyond rewriting political maps or shifting technologies. It seeded the Western mind with a powerful and enduring myth, the myth of the cataclysm. When a historical event is vast, poorly understood, and carries the weight of genuine mystery, it ceases to be mere fact and becomes a wellspring for the imagination. It transforms from a chapter in a textbook into a shadow on the wall of our collective consciousness, shaping how we think about time, legacy, and the inevitable turning of ages. We use its shape to tell stories about ourselves, to process our own fears of fragility, and to marvel at the sheer scale of what can be lost and what can, against all odds, begin again in the silence that follows. The greatest mysteries are the ones that refuse to be solved. For all we have pieced together about the Bronze Age collapse, the shadows at the edges of the story remain deep and compelling, drawing researchers back with questions that have no final answers. One of the most persistent enigmas is the precise origin of the groups we call the Sea Peoples. We have their names from Egyptian inscriptions, the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, but these are labels given by their victims, not self-identifications. Were they a confederation from specific, now lost homelands in the Aegean or Anatolia? Or were they a more fluid assembly of displaced peoples from multiple regions, a maritime coalition of the desperate? Each new archaeological find offers a clue, but the full map of their journeys remains frustratingly blank, a ghostly migration recorded only in its destructive wake. Equally complex is the question of sequence and weight. We know the collapse was a perfect storm, but which thunderclap came first, and which downpour finally broke the levees? In Anatolia, was it the drought that crippled the Hittites, or the cutting of their Syrian grain supply that came before? In Greece, did internal warfare between Mycenaean kings weaken the palaces before the migrations arrived, or was it the other way around? the evidence suggests a different cascade in each region, a unique recipe for disaster where climate, invasion, and revolt were mixed in varying proportions. Untangling this knot is not just academic, it helps us understand how complex systems fail in different ways under similar pressures. Then there is the silent history, the story of the ordinary person. We see the ash layers of burned palaces and the shattered pottery of elite tombs. But what was it like for the farmer watching the tax collector demand grain from a barren field? What conversations happened in the homes of potters and weavers as the trade for their goods dried up? How did families decide in that final season to pack what they could carry and walk away from homes their ancestors had built? This intimate, human-scale experience of the collapse is almost entirely lost to us, whispered only in the broad patterns of abandoned villages and new settlements in the highlands. With the extinction of scripts like Linear B, we lost more than administrative records. We lost their literature, their songs, their daily jokes, and their personal prayers. A Mycenaean poet's verse, a Hittite merchant's diary, a Cypriot king's memoir all turned to dust. These were not just documents, they were the inner voices of those civilizations. Their silence is a permanent gap, a reminder that history is written largely by the survivors and the scribes, and that the full human chorus of an age can be silenced in a generation. Yet these mysteries are not failures, they are invitations. Every unanswered question is a beacon for the next generation of explorers. Today, the tools of discovery are more powerful than ever. Genetic analysis of ancient remains can trace population movements with startling precision, potentially linking bones found in a Philistine cemetery to specific regions of the Aegean. Underwater archaeology is probing sunken Bronze Age shipwrecks off the Turkish coast, time capsules that could reveal the final cargoes of a collapsing trade network. Refined climate models using data from seabed cores and cave stalagmites are painting an ever sharper picture of ancient droughts, telling us not just that it was dry, but exactly how dry and for how long in each vulnerable valley. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is not a closed book on a library shelf. It is an ongoing excavation, a live conversation between the past and the present. Each season of digging, each new technological breakthrough promises to add a sentence, a paragraph, perhaps even a new chapter to this epic human drama. This unfinished nature is what makes history a living discipline, forever open to reinterpretation. It reminds us that the past is not a fixed point, but a landscape we are continually mapping, discovering that with every mystery we solve, two more fascinating questions seem to rise from the earth to take its place. This 3,000-year-old disaster is not a dusty relic, it is a mirror. The collapse of the Bronze Age matters today because it is one of history's most complete case studies in how complex societies fail and how people endure what comes next. It forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. The myth of inevitable progress is just that, a myth. Human history is not a straight line ascending forever upward. Civilizations can and do move backward in complexity. They can lose writing, forget monumental architecture, and see their economies shrink to a local scale, all within a few generations. This is not a judgment on those societies, it is a sobering fact of our shared past. It reminds us that the comforts and connections of our modern world are not a guaranteed inheritance, but a fragile achievement that requires conscious stewardship. The story of the collapse underscores our fundamental, inescapable entanglement with the natural world. Those kingdoms did not fall in a vacuum, they were stressed and then broken by a changing climate they could neither control nor fully comprehend. Their fate is a powerful testament to the fact that environmental stability is the non-negotiable foundation upon which all human complexity is built. When that foundation shifts, everything built upon it trembles. Yet within that same story lies our greatest source of hope, resilience. From the ashes of that old, rigid world, humanity did not vanish. It adapted, it reinvented. The Phoenicians took to the sea and gave us the alphabet. Communities in the highlands forged new social contracts and spiritual ideas. Villagers across Greece and Anatolia, through gritty necessity, mastered the forge and ushered in the Iron Age. The political experiments that followed, from the citizen assemblies of Greek city-states to the merchant councils of Phoenician ports, were direct responses to the failure of the old top-down model. The collapse was a brutal filter, but it was also a moment of immense creativity. It cleared away entrenched systems and made space for new ways of thinking about community, power, and identity. In a very real sense, the classical world that gave us so much of our own philosophical and political vocabulary was born from the lessons learned in this ancient ruin. Studying this collapse, therefore, is an exercise in both humility and perspective. It asks us to look at our own glittering, interconnected global civilization and to consider its long-term sustainability. Are we, like the late Bronze Age kingdoms, building a system of profound interdependence without sufficient resilience? Are we attentive enough to the environmental foundations that support our entire way of life? The past does not offer blueprints, but it provides urgent questions. Ultimately, this ancient catastrophe teaches us that endings are also beginnings. It shows the incredible capacity of human communities to regroup, to innovate, and to find a path forward even when the old maps no longer apply. The story does not tell us that collapse is inevitable, but that transformation is. And in that understanding, we find not a prophecy of doom, but a call to thoughtful, resilient building. The ruins of Hattusa and Mycenaean are more than archaeological sites. They are monuments to a profound historical truth. Our journey through the smoke of the late Bronze Age has revealed a collapse not of a single kingdom, but of an entire interconnected world. It was brought down by a perfect storm, a convergence of invasions by displaced sea peoples, a prolonged and punishing climate shift, internal social revolts from overburdened populations, and a fatal flaw in the system itself, an interdependence so deep that a shock in one region became a catastrophe for all. This was not a slow decline, but a rapid unraveling, a dramatic simplification. As the scholar Joseph Tainter observed, collapse is fundamentally a rapid, significant loss of a society's established complexity. The grand palaces, the international diplomacy, the specialized scribes, and the vast bronze trade networks, that intricate web of civilization frayed and then snapped within a few generations. Yet from that simplification, a new world was hammered into being. The collapse was a violent, transformative reset that rewrote the course of history. It shattered the old, rigid orders of divine kings and palace bureaucracies, clearing the ground for astonishing innovation. Out of necessity came the widespread adoption of iron, a democratic metal that freed communities from fragile, far-flung supply chains. From the ashes of coastal cities rose the Phoenicians, master sailors who gave us the alphabet, a tool of thought that would outlast any empire. In the fractured landscape, new experiments in living together took root, from the citizen-focused city-states of Greece to the covenant-based tribes of the Israelite highlands. The trauma of 1200 BC did not end human progress. It redirected it, forging the very foundations of the classical age that would follow. The legacy of this ancient catastrophe is a dual reminder, one of fragility and the other of resilience. It whispers to us across 3 millennia about the vulnerability of even the most glittering civilizations when their foundations are stressed. It shows how environmental change, economic interdependence, and social strain can combine in a cascade of failure. But it also shouts of the incredible human capacity to adapt, to innovate, and to begin again. The story does not tell us that collapse is inevitable, but that transformation is. As we reflect on these echoes from the past, we are left to ponder our own interconnected world. What lessons do you take from this great unraveling? Which thread of the collapse, the climate, the migrations, or the internal failures feels most resonant to you today? Share your perspective in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into history's mysteries compelling, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing for more journeys into the past. Thank you for watching.